Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Hatley. I'm the CEO of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. Thank you for joining this webinar this morning. We're expecting a few more people to come in, but in the interest of time, and given that we've got a decent sized panel this morning, we might start. And those who come a bit later on will either catch up with where we're at, or there'll be a video available for viewing after the event as well. Before we begin, I'm going to pay an acknowledgement of country using a video that we've prepared for this purpose. So bear with me 1 minute.
Wherever you are across Australia,
we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land.
The Darug peoples.
The Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
The Gundungurra people of the Southern Highlands.
The Ngunnawal people of the Canberra region on whose country we are standing.
And all other peoples of this vast continent.
Their ongoing connection through custodianship of its land and waters.
Physical and spiritual.
Through culture, language and ceremony.
Where sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to elders past, present and still to come.
Thank you. And for my part, I'm joining the meeting today from Ngunnawal country in the ACT. If anybody on the meeting would like to just share in the chat which traditional lands they're joining the meeting from, that feel free to do so if you'd like as well. Now, this is the 8th in our series of 9 webinars, and we are going to be recording the session today. It'll be available on the Academy website in a week or so. Our panelists will be on that video, but none of the participants will be. So you don't need to worry about whether your names will be shared in a public video. So with that, I'd like to now start by introducing our series convener, Professor Roy Mccloud. Roy is a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences and a fellow of the Academy of Humanities. And he has pulled together this wonderful program of 9 webinar series. Roy, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris, and good morning to all. Greetings from the traditional lands of the Cammeraygal people, Neutral Bay in Sydney. And welcome to, as Chris says, the 8th of 9 sessions on Australia's future in science, an emerging agenda for the social sciences. Now, my name is Roy Mccloud. I'm a historian of science, an emeritus professor of history at Sydney University, and sometimes Charles Lindbergh, professor in aerospace history at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. As one born in the Kennedy generation who's lived with space most of his life, I would like to share with you my interest and my passion in this adventure, and also some of my concerns for its future direction. Some may say that to launch such a series in the midst of the worst pandemic in a century, and amidst our present concerns with climate change, and human rights, not to mention the unfolding tragedies in Afghanistan and Africa, is perhaps not the best idea. But for a moment, I think it's important that we do this. And I'd like you to sit with me and slip the surly bonds of Earth and consider what might be awakening us in space and may well be upon us even before the end of the present decade. For many, the idea that we will be active in space is already a given. During the last few years, most of us will have watched the rapid series of space-related events taking place around the world. In 2019, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing. In 2020, the International Space Station celebrated its 20th anniversary. And this year, there have been, so far, no fewer than 11 significant space missions. In February, we were brought extraordinary views of Mars when the UAE's Hope successfully orbited the red planet. In March, we saw the success of SpaceX, and in June, news of NASA's commercial payload services. And soon we are to see the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope, one of the most ambitious missions in space yet to be undertaken. And perhaps next month, we're to be seeing the launch of NASA's Orion mission as well. All of these, of course, are the work of science and technology on a grand scale. But we've also seen in recent months the arrival of new forms of human endeavor, some in the shape of space tourism, led by Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, soon I'm sure to be followed by Elon Musk. This is immediately signaled to us that space is a very human enterprise, replete with human stories of competition and controversy. And many see in this a danger of first principles and idealistic possibilities being rushed by commercialization and militarization, and as some of our earlier sessions have suggested, weaponization as well, raising many questions about the ethics and behavior that should frame our presence in space. Moreover, as we have become accustomed to know, space has become an integral enabler of military operations. And from the space-based detection of ballistic missile systems, to overhead intelligence sensing and threat detection, global security and communications, and space has become a contested area, a contested region, with competing powers such as the United States and China remarkably developing plans to deny one another freedom of maneuver. Well, meanwhile, of course, as against this, we've seen the hard work of diplomats and international lawyers continue, debating and hoping to improve upon the promise of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And we've had, since October of last year, the Artemis Accords, which, in the words of NASA, are set to create a safe and transparent environment that facilitates exploration, science, and commercial activities for all of humanity to enjoy. And in consequence of all of this, we've begun to think more closely about the social and human interactions we're likely to see in space. And the questions begin to arise: how are we to conduct ourselves and behave towards these new, for us, these new environments? How will our interactions with space, driven inevitably by a few, affect the many, and we hope benefit the many? And such questions indeed force us to reflect upon the role the social sciences ought to play, hand in hand with the natural sciences and technologies that have so far dominated the scene. Well, in this active reflection, I believe it's important also to fashion a focus on Australia and Australia's particular, special, present and potential participation in the enterprise. Historians such as Kerry Doherty and others have recorded Australia's long history of engagement with space. Since 2018, we have our own space agency, which we hope will open new frontiers. We have excellent media coverage and several centers devoted to space law and strategy and defense. We have teams at University of New South Wales, particularly, who've developed a sophisticated CubeSat. And at Curtin, just the other day, there is sending into approximate space, the International Space Station, the first of the so-called binary satellites, which they see as the beginning of a constellation of Australia's satellite contribution to space. Also, of course, we have in Australia, particularly in WA, developments in automation and robotics that will be suggesting to many how the geology and geography and climate of the outback makes for particularly interesting analogs useful in testing systems that may be usable elsewhere, notably on Mars. But all this is very promising. But as social scientists and humanists, we must ask even more fundamental questions, not only about the how and the means and the methods, but also about whether, the why, to what ends and with what consequences. We must question in whose interest do we as Australia venture first to the moon, then to Mars and beyond. Well, to these larger set of questions that the series has been devoted. 9 moderators and their teams have accepted our invitation to draw upon the respective discourses of culture, history, health, heritage, law, defense, diplomacy, industry, and dealing with the practicalities of being in space, of going there and being there together. And to conclude the series, which comes to an end tomorrow, we've asked a generation of young Australians still at school to join us and to reflect upon the prospect of their own spacefaring future. Well, I hope you will enjoy this series. I hope you'll be able to look back and recover some of the sessions that have been recorded, and perhaps participate in conversations with our many panelists. Warm acknowledgements at the moment go to all the members of all the teams and to the many who have helped us in these difficult times, notably Dr. Chris Hatherley of the Academy of the Social Sciences, my colleagues in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Sydney University. Also, thanks to our guides, Jose Torrealba and Jacob Craig, and most especially to my colleague, Ms. Claire McFarland, for getting us safely underway. What then are our questions? Now, I turn from my role as convener to my role as moderator to put our agenda to you and to ask our speakers, our panelists, to think along with me some tentative answers to some of the questions that we think uppermost in our minds. What should be our principles and priorities and interests in going into space? We think we know the principal drivers, but what guidance should we give our drivers? As for Australia, what role can Australia best play in the present and future development of space research, exploration, and even potential settlement? Can we act internationally as both friendly critic and constable of conventions that we may help devise and seek to apply? Or are we destined to play a subsidiary role, a willing servant to more powerful friends? Can we be a source of inspiration and imagination and sense-making for the rest of the world? What can we offer specifically the international space missions, perhaps notably in our knowledge and experience of extreme environments? How can space contribute to our role and standing in the international community? Always a consideration that we should keep in mind. And then moving on, what factors have conditioned our response to the challenge of space? How have we so far contributed, and with what success? How can we as Australians with our long Indigenous heritage offer ourselves as an example, both positive and negative perhaps, in comprehending nature and the means of our survival in extreme environments? How does law, technology, and culture condition and impact our role in space? Typically, as we know, technology drives the law, but does culture drive technology? Once we are well beyond the exosphere, what factors ought to condition our behavior? How seriously must we take our responsibility as custodians and guardians? And in what ways can we act nationally as well as collectively to enshrine and ensure that role as custodians and as guardians? And finally, given the more obvious costs of doing all this, what are the risks and benefits for us? as a nation, as a society, as a community? What do we collectively stand to gain from going to being in space? What will being in space, temporarily losing sight of Earth, perhaps permanently losing sight of Earth for some of us, shift our narrow perspectives, our earthbound ways of thinking, and help to teach us about ourselves and about our lives and about what we do and how we treat our environment. And certainly more widely about the virtues of sustainability, community, and cooperation that are certainly that are inevitably involved in any activity in space. Well, to discuss these questions and others, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Beginning with Dr. Catherine O'Sullivan from CSIRO, who completed her degrees at the University of Queensland. She's an expert on the production of biofuels and the cycling of nutrients. And her recent work has expanded to include explorations of the relations between plants and soil microbes. Some of her work could easily be applicable, I hope, to the space enterprise. We have Thomas Gooch, the founder of the Office of Planetary Observations, and a founding member of the Moon Village Association, who has initiated really rather remarkable global discussions about how to consider a landscape-sensitive perspective in space. We have Tristan Moss, a senior lecturer in the Griffith Asia Institute and historian, researching space history in Australia and the history of the ADF with a focus on its culture and policy. He's particularly interested now in the history of Australia in space, and we welcome his thoughts about the past as well as the future. We have James Tanner among us, who is a research assistant at the moment at the University of Sydney's Law School, who is fascinated by all things to do with space, especially the role of the social sciences. And he's completed recently an excellent honors thesis on the subject of property rights and theories suitable for underpinning a system of lunar property development. And we have, lastly, but certainly not least, Claire McFarland, my colleague, who has a background spanning 3 sectors in research organization, government, and industry. She is an expert in innovation and entrepreneurship studies and has worked for government as well as industry. And she describes herself as a space enthusiast and is endlessly curious about the way things are as they are. And happily, she's bringing all this knowledge and experience to our table this morning. I welcome our first panelist to embark upon our conversation. And I turn first, please, if I may, to Catherine. Catherine, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Roy. Thanks, everyone, for having me and giving me the opportunity to kick off the conversation today. Before I begin, I'd just like to pay my respects to the elders and peoples of the Bundjalung Nation, which is where I sit in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. And I guess I should note I feel I'm a bit of a fish out of water here because I'm very definitely a technologist and my experience in the humanities is fairly limited. So I'm going to focus my conversation on the technological perspective of the questions that Roy posed, and hopefully the rest of the group can correct and add to those comments as they see fit. To start off, I guess I want to dig into that big question of why we're going to space, and I really see 4 aspects to it when I break it down. One is well, overarching, I guess, to begin, is the fact that we go to space because the benefits outweigh the risk. And it's really about the fact that there are things we can do in space that we can't do on Earth. And to me, that spans the 4 aspects of fundamental science, applied science, the potential for commercial ventures, and also inspiration and education. by fundamental science, I mean understanding our place in the universe and what the universe is. And that's things like the basic exploration and discovery of astronomy and cosmology, things like the Hubble telescope and the Mars rover and the Voyager missions. But it's also about chemistry and physics and understanding how molecules behave when they're in microgravity and how genetics respond and all of those sorts of really fundamental sciences. And those lead on necessarily to the applied sciences, which is how we will use that knowledge. And my personal interest in that space is really around closed systems and habitats. So if we want to live on the moon or on Mars, how are we going to mimic the essential ecosystem services that Earth provides to us? So we're going to have to create systems that cycle water for us the way rainfall and evaporation and transpiration does, and cycle nitrogen for us so that our waste can be made into food, and even store carbon for us. So what we learn from building those technologies in that really extreme environment will feed back and tell us a lot about ways that we can improve our practices in agriculture and food technology and all sorts of sciences on Earth. And that will lead to the commercial outcomes. So we heard a little bit last week from Craig Lindley, who was discussing the potential for things like mining. And he made a very good case that, you know, it's pretty borderline whether it's worth doing that. But there are things happening in space that are beneficial right now. So there's some beautiful experiments happening on the ISS, which are in collaboration with some drug companies that are looking at how molecules crystallize in microgravity, because it happens very differently than it does on Earth, and it's leading to drugs that have different activities. Then it's the same drug, same basic chemistry, but different activities because of the different physics of how they formed. So that sort of, there's going to be a lot of beneficial commercial ventures that aren't necessarily obvious when we look at it from the outset. There'll be those sorts of spin-out technologies. And then the last thing that I think really can't be understated is that information education piece. And there's a beautiful thing happening right now in the CSIRO in collaboration with a lot of schools and a lot of other agencies are part of the Seeds in Space program. And we sent some golden wattle seeds to the ISS. They spent a couple of months up there. This was in collaboration with JAXA. They've now come back to Earth and we're sending them around to schools and they will be grown out. And what they're looking for are changes in the architecture and flowering and all these different things in that plant as a result of the mutations that would likely have happened because of the microgravity and radiation and things that those seeds saw when they're in space. Now, there's some beautiful science in that, but it's also going to engage a new generation of school children in botany and space and, you know, all of these different sciences. So that's a really important part of all of this. Moving on to what the priorities and drivers are and should be. I would say I don't have a good answer for this. As a technologist, I think this needs a lot of oversight and big thought, but comfortingly, the Australian Space Agency is in the process at the moment of developing roadmaps for different parts of science. And the CSIRO and the NEES who are engaged in this space are working through that as well. So I see that as very comforting. Really, I think it comes down to what our needs and wants are, what can we get back from these endeavours, and also what our strengths are. And obviously, with my background, I can see the obvious strengths in agriculture and mining and remote living. Pardon me. Things like the Australian Antarctic Division are a really good example of how we can administer and do science in an extreme environment. But we've also got things like the flying doctors and delivering medicine in remote locations. And the last thing I really want to comment on is Australia's role. And again, it's one that I think it's going to vary depending on what we're doing and how we're doing it. But I would say it is going to be necessarily collaborative. And one of the big tricky things, I think, is managing the geopolitics and the negotiation that's going to be part of that. Because I think no matter what, we're probably going to deliver as part of a team. And it might be with NASA and JAXA and ESA and everyone else, or it might be with a commercial partner. But I can see that there's going to be collaboration and there's going to be geopolitics that has to be worked around in there. And within that, I would say one thing that really needs to stay front of mind is to consider not just what our strengths and capacities are to deliver, but also what our needs are and what we can get back from all of that. That needs to be part of that thought process. But I'll leave my comments there. Thanks very much, Roy.
Thank you, Catherine. Tom, can I look to you as you're next in front of me? What is your response to our very ambitious agenda?
Yeah, thanks, Roy, and thanks for having us. Great to be here with everyone. Yeah, just to answer those questions, I guess why are we going to a space now with new space? I think it's potentially largely setting up the infrastructure for a sustainable space journey into the future. And as we did go to the moon previously, it was driven by government, which then essentially became unsustainable economically to keep that process going. So now building in the infrastructure and the economy to go there long term, driven largely by resource mining, and the learnings happening is perhaps setting up that for long term intergenerational goals. Personally, going to space, I can attest to having spent 200 days in lockdown that getting out of your domain to new ventures is very beneficial, and you actually get a lot of learnings from that, which you can integrate back into your personal life, and I think society and humanity as a whole. So venturing out and setting up the infrastructure is key to further learnings for us to further ourselves. What is our role as Australians? I think we have a real opportunity to be disruptive, actually, and be critical and provide leapfrog opportunities. And I think there's perhaps not enough of that happening in the industry, and aligning with our global partners is perhaps taking precedent. But Australians have a great way of critical thinking that other countries don't, and we're leaders in tech and innovation in specific areas. And we should really build on that. And this being a social sciences webinar series, I think valuing that and really encouraging these non-typical space actors to think critically and bring that into industry is really something we can offer, and not being afraid of challenging the norm or disrupting how people see and disrupting the typical space paradigm. Lastly, how do we perform that role or act? I think there's a real opportunity for social sciences in universities to set up a startup community, and within those universities really link with tech, link with other sectors in the uni, and highlight the importance of social sciences, but bringing that to the startup method of creating, prototyping, MVP, iterating, and then taking that to industry and partnering with big organizations towards providing value add. And, some examples of that might be equality, gender equity, diversity and inclusion. The social sciences presents lots of different ways of seeing that we can take to market. And I think we need to really step up and really speak the language of business. Business is essentially creativity commercialized. And it's that critical thinking, taking it through a pipeline to everyday activities that Australia has a real opportunity to lead in the world and make that a reality. So there's a little snapshot of my thoughts. Thanks, Roy.
Thank you very much. Very, very, very constructive. I hope you'll be able to talk to the children next session, who have already proposed, and they've told me to be aware that they want to develop an international organization on the model of the WHO, which they're going to call the WSO, the World Space Organization, which will be disruptive.
Fantastic.
Very much appeal to your sensibility, I think. What do you think, Tristan, about all this, looking to the past and our mixed history in Australia in relation to space? We've had some wonderful successes, but then we've had long periods of stasis and doldrum. What's our future?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's fantastic to be able to talk about space and also to talk about what the social sciences can add to this conversation, because I'm never tired of saying that this is not a technical question alone. It's also one of policy. It's also one of culture. So it's really important that we have this conversation, that we're part of this conversation. So thank you. Look, I'd answer this question about why we want to go to space and what we want to do there with further questions in typical academic style. I think that Australia is still coming to grips with why it wants to go to space. Countries go to space, and ultimately, this is still very much a national endeavour. As much as there's international collaborations in space, ultimately it's governments and taxpayers that pay for space or enable through regulation industry to go to space and through funding as well. So countries go to space to further their values, to put it really broadly, as broadly as I possibly can. One value is science. The pursuit of science is a value. It's something we see as a social good. It's not an end in and of itself. It should have benefits either to making my life better, or because we think we're better people because we've engaged in science. Other values include security, which no one's really mentioned yet, but is so profoundly important to what we do in space. And you cannot talk about space without talking about security. There is no going to the moon without the Cold War. It just wouldn't have been funded. So when I talk to my students in another life with another hat on about colonisation, I say in a very broad sense we can describe the reasons that countries colonise other areas and other peoples is because of God, gold and glory. So, and you can apply that to space, this idea that we go to space for gods or ideas, we go to space for gold, so to make money, and glory, which can be described as national prestige. And without those broad sort of goals in space, we don't go there. There's a reason we haven't gone to Mars yet, is because it's too expensive. There's no sort of driving ideological need yet. But we did go to the moon because it was achievable and there was a driving ideological need at the time. To wrap up, to go back to my questions, I think we have a very broad sense of what we want to do in space in 50 or 100 years. And we know what we're doing right now. I think there's a disconnect in Australia between those two states. And I think Australia is still yet to have a conversation about what we want to do in space, what we're willing to pay for. And this goes back to the history piece, which basically shows us that there's been lots of suggestions for us to have a space program from the late 50s onwards, from prior to Sputnik being launched in 1957. These have gone, some have been accepted, some have been rejected outright. And this speaks to perhaps an unwillingness of the Australian people to expend resources, whether money or energy, on space. And I think we need to come to grips with why that has been the case in the past, and what Australians are willing to do now in space and why. And I think that's where the social sciences can really have an impact on this conversation, is looking at what's gone in the past, looking at the ideas around us going to space, and then be able to frame policy around that. And Australia still doesn't have a comprehensive and whole of government space policy that defines where we want to go into space. And I think without that, we can talk as much as we like, but we're not going to go to space in anything but a fragmented way. And so that's where the people in this room really have something to offer, I would say.
Thank you very much for that. And may I foreshadow other questions by asking, who will be the drivers of this?
Who will be the drivers?
Yes. Is it to be industry? Is it to be the mining companies? Or that's where the money is?
Certainly. It depends on who you ask.
Yes.
So space in Australia has always been fragmented, usually along defence and civil lines. So defence has a lot of roles in space. Currently, if you look at the policy that is put out by Australian government, it's profoundly and overwhelmingly about industry. It's about jobs and growth. So if you ask the Australian government at the moment, the drivers will be government enabling industry. But I think there's a limit to how much there'll be interest in that being the case. And there is a question to be raised. If we're only after getting jobs out of space, well, then why not have a car industry or build our own planes and tanks, which we don't. So I think there's other questions to be asked. But at the moment, government is mostly interested in industry and defence as well.
Yes. Thank you very much. You underline a lot of things that I'm sure other people should be giving much more thought to. James, can you come on board? Where are you, James?
Yes. Hello. Thank you so much, Roy, and thank you. Hello to you all. Very excited to be joining. I think, like many, as a young child, always interested in space and by what we can do there. And today I acknowledge the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land I'm speaking from. And to start from the very beginning, there was a session about Indigenous astronomy, first in space, I think last week, and Gilla Anderson, an elder, gave some amazing information about what Aboriginal Australians have been doing with regards to space and what they see and have been looking into the sky for 50,000 years, and all the relationships they see between the Earth, the sun, the moon, between the Earth and the sky, and that though these might seem like they're separate entities, in fact, there are many links between them. And for me, I think what's very important is that we, in our quest for space, in our quest for exploration and resources, that we don't destroy these relationships, that we don't destroy all the beauty and the wonder that space has to offer. So I think for me, what's really important is that technology doesn't outpace the law or regulation when it comes to space. I think we see, for example, that with the internet, where technology has outpaced the law, there are many problems today. We know, free speech and fake news and privacy and many of those other problems, which we don't want to see, I think, problems in the space context. So I think that if we, going back to addressing the driver's point, I think that means that while there are currently the drivers of, the big titans of industry, and we have, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, I think what's really important is that we get as diverse a perspective as possible to ensure that it's not just people interested or invested in development, but also people interested in other things, more like perhaps research or perhaps just preserving what is there to lead development or to contribute to development so that it doesn't destroy the wonder of what is there. So I think where Australia can contribute to all of this is that we can use the natural geographic advantages that we have, especially when it comes to looking at the sky and recording what's going on in the sky, to bargain internationally, to say, well, we'll only offer you these things, or we'll only give you what we have to offer if, X or Y regulation is in place, or if we can do something to address this particular problem at the moment. So I think I'm very keen and I'm all in favor of allowing exploration and development, but making sure that the law doesn't outpace, the technology doesn't outpace the law, so that when it happens, it's fair, it's ethical, and it doesn't destroy that amazing place, which is space.
Well, thank you very much, James. A very, very good introductory speech. I hope you'll stand for Parliament. Good. And coming round now to Claire. You have a very broad brief here, and you've seen the spectrum from 60,000 years ago to the infinite future. What do you think, in general, is going to be our contribution, and what sense are we making of space in Australia?
Thank you, Roy. And it's really great to have been a part of bringing this vision to life and getting social scientists to start thinking more broadly about space. One of the things that has always struck me when we're thinking about space and talking about space is that while so much of the focus is on the rockets and the launch and the technology, and this was why we wanted to start with this idea of sense making about space, the fact is that there is this enduring fascination with space. And even if you go and look at something as simple as the top grossing films of all time, out of the top 5 of them, 4 of them are about space or people from space coming to Earth. So, it's Avatar, it's Another World, it's Avengers, Endgame and Infinity War, and it's Star Wars. Those are the top grossing films. We are endlessly fascinated with space, and yet we seem to get captured by the rockets as opposed to what do the worlds look like and how would we live and what does that mean? And so I think that there's this kind of balance between the imagination and the escapism and the reality of doing it. And that's one of the things that we wanted to get social scientists really thinking about. In terms of the leading principles that should guide us, one of the leading principles that I think is the most important when it comes to technology is just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I think that that is a really, really important principle when we're thinking about space. If you look at technology in recent times, we have had some really significant challenges around the we can do this. If you look at things like Cambridge Analytica's use of targeting to influence voting, if you look at the use of facial recognition technology for law enforcement purposes, these are really significant and difficult challenges that come from this thinking that, but we can do this. So I think when it comes to space, just because we can doesn't mean that we should, and therefore we need to be thinking about what that means. In terms of for Australia, Australia has a really unique position in the world. In one sense, because of our geographic location, we are kind of halfway between Europe and America, in the middle of the Indo-Pacific, which is a very important and kind of contested area at the moment. And we have this reputation as a strong liberal democracy, really bound by the rule of law. And we're really valued as allies by other larger powers. And so I think this gives us more diplomatic power than is probably visible, and a strong position to argue from diplomatically and perhaps behind the scenes than is perhaps given credit for. But I think that we need to use that judiciously and think about what that looks like. One of the reasons really, I think, for having a space agency in Australia was to be able to bring some of the talented people that have left Australian shores and gone to Europe and the US to work in space, is to give them a reason to come home to Australia. And so I think that the space agency gives people that reason and will help from this point forward build capability in that area. And I guess the final thing that I would just maybe this is a point that we need to discuss, this idea about how law and technology and culture drive each other. One of the things that often I think we think that technology comes first and then law comes after that. But one of the things that I've been looking at is the way in which new paths are created, the way in which new things are done. And we're really seeing this play out at the moment with this push by Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic and SpaceX to do things differently. And I think what we need to remember is that the entrepreneurs behind these companies are not government officials. They don't have that background, whereas previously people who've gone to space have come through this kind of government policy way of thinking. Successful entrepreneurs do things differently. They're used to moving quickly, they take risks, they break things, and have a tendency to ask for forgiveness after the fact than permission beforehand. And I think that those are some of the challenges that we need to be thinking about as we shift from government being the driver of space to entrepreneurs driving space, and the challenges that are inherent with that. And that, I think, provides a really strong role for social scientists to speak up about some of these matters. So I'll leave it there because we should have some questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure you have your own private list of the entrepreneurs whom you're going to ask after the session is ended to step up. And thank you all, really, for these wonderful responses. To summarize very quickly indeed, to looking first to the science and what we can actually contribute in terms of science. Secondly, in terms of what we can help to crystallize, more or less, as a way of proceeding. Australians are disruptive and can be disruptive in a constructive sense. Australians have always been interested in bringing people together. I notice in terms of regional policy, I'm in my own studies of the Australia Group, for example, in relation to chemical and biological warfare and nuclear non-proliferation. These have often been led. Of course, one of the charter signatories of the United Nations was an Australian. So we have a strong history of all of that. And so as a small power and a power that doesn't threaten, we're not threatening to invade anybody at the moment. And so we have, I think, a rather interesting influence altogether. The question arises, of course, in the background as to whether we are to be deferential eternally to another power or powers, and to work to their agenda rather than having our own sovereign agenda of some kind. I think it was implicit in some of what Christian was saying, that if we could get a hold of government view on things, that maybe we could develop a sovereign strategy of some kind that would undoubtedly fit the other criteria of cooperation, communication, and financial association as well. But so we may or may not wish to see ourselves as a permanent subsidiary of NASA, for example, in relation to the science and space. But I think there are also some interesting questions that you raise as to the talent involved. Do we have enough people, the right stuff, so to speak? And if we are looking for the right stuff, we're looking for astronauts, of course, but we're also, I'm conscious of the community. What was it, 4 or 5 people that Musk took on his weekend experience. And these included people who would have no particular experience of space. They're tourists, all right? And although I'm not an advocate of space tourism per se, I'm interested in the response that ordinary human beings, fit perhaps for purpose, but not specialists in the subject, that ordinary people are going to have of going to space and being there. And certainly if we do establish permanent settlements, now we have evidences of liquid water on the moon, possibly in several places, so there may be several settlements there, and these are going to be occupied in a quasi-permanent fashion, not always by the same people, but people in combination, and they'll be dealing with people from other countries and cultures. So there will be a dynamic there on the moon, potentially, or it's worth imagining this at least. And what will that entail? And how do we train the right stuff, so to speak, or bring up or attract the right stuff in Australia to participate in that? Anyway, these are some of the thoughts that I've had too. And I very much appreciate what James and Catherine have, and Tom and Tristan have contributed. I wonder, is there anyone in the chat? No, not yet. Is that right? No, not yet. So I'm afraid we don't have any questions yet, which gives us another 10 minutes or so to conclude.
Can I say something, Roy?
Anyone come back? Yes, please.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to the point of deference that you're saying to NASA or other, I think could risk kind of defining space and limiting ourselves, and not kind of being inclusive and wide-ranging of non-typical space thinking. And I think it's the social sciences which provide really unique insights from research, and the challenge, as I mentioned, is actually taking that to commercial realities. And I think Claire you have a background in that, Claire, is my understanding, which I think is really key to this kind of discussion, because we can talk about it as much as we like. But Scott Pace mentioned in a recent article, those who turn up make the rules. But we're turning up by having a webinar. So how do we keep contributing to that discussion?
Yeah, that is really true, Thomas. And I think that is where there's been so much, and I'm really torn with the Musk, Branson, Bezos thing, right? Because part of me goes, this is amazing that they are pushing this boundary. And part of me goes, this is horrifying that they are pushing this boundary, right? And so there's this tension between government had stopped pushing the boundary, and you have these people who step in to fill that void. And then, you have that kind of the challenges of all the things that aren't being considered or could possibly go wrong. And I think that is where the rest of us need to step up and not just let that wave flow forward, that we all need to be active actors in terms of thinking about how you do the groundwork for space. And that was why this session was so important for Roy and I, because we could see that social scientists have a really strong role to play in this, and we want to bring them to the table and get them thinking about these kind of challenges, because it's only by having these kind of conversations that we will be able to do that. And to be honest, I was kind of amazed at how quickly we were able to bring together quite a large group of social scientists who were thinking about this and considering this. And I think that in itself shows that there's quite a lot going on in this area.
Well, I agree, and I too have been pleased. One of our previous moderators, who's our leading aviation and space medical person, who is a consultant also with the Space Agency, spoke very warmly of the need for social scientists. And he said the only social scientist on the Space Agency's advisory board now is a psychologist. Now, I have nothing against psychologists. Some of my best friends are psychologists. But I would say that that's not enough, that it doesn't begin or let alone end the story. We have a lot to contribute. And they, of course, by choosing a psychologist, I think were particularly interested in the recruitment of people for going into space, of course, in the usual way. And you need psychologists to attest people's fitness and suitability for working in confined environments, whether they be submarines or Antarctica or such difficult spaces as we will encounter. But the larger issues that we've been talking about, I think, have not yet crossed the horizon of the Space Agency. And that is what I'm hoping we can do. And in fact, another one of our moderators, taking a leaf from the same book, has suggested that we should, in fact, suggest to the Space Agency, they have a technical advisory committee, that social scientists ought to be invited to that apparatus. The apparatus exists. There's just a gap in the apparatus, we might say. Well, that's for the Space Agency, of course. But then there's the wider point that Claire and others have made as to the whole realm. Now, CSIRO is deeply invested in space, is it not, Catherine? And in fact, CSIRO is our biggest science component in the area. Isn't that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're certainly not alone. I mean, several of the universities around the country, and Adelaide, you mentioned Curtin. I mean, yeah, we're certainly not alone, but we are, I mean, we've traditionally had custodianship of facilities like the Parkes telescopes. We're involved in the Square Kilometre Array, but increasingly we are using space technology in other ways. So within agriculture, we're using satellite imagery to, assess and monitor, and there's communications technology and data management and all of these sorts of things. But I do think there's been a shift in CSIRO's thinking and culture in recent times that really has embraced some of the discussion, some of the points that have been discussed here, particularly around entrepreneurship and the need to get hard scientists like myself thinking about how do we transfer what we've learned into something that's usable and has impact for people. And I completely agree that thinking around entrepreneurship and commercialization and all of those sorts of things need to come in early. I'm also really conscious of some of the points that Tristan spoke to of where we were historically and what the geopolitical implications are. So I'm really conscious that at the moment we're aligning a lot with NASA because that's a pathway for delivering things. And I don't know if that's a product of history or just circumstance, but it has implications. If China does really well in their habitat technology and pushes forward, and we've strongly aligned with NASA, are we limiting ourselves by making choices without really thinking about it?
Well, I think you make, if I may say, an extremely important point in what you've just said. Quite separately, we have a project at Sydney with our China Studies Center. We have a person called Yuan Wei. Some of you may remember her. She was to have been part of this panel. Unfortunately, because her teaching timetable, terribly overburdened, doesn't permit her. But she is Chinese. She's a postdoc at Sydney in architecture. She is a landscape architect, and she has been working with me to develop a list of Chinese researchers, academics, who have a relationship with the Chinese space effort, but are not part of the military. So they're able to correspond with us, and we've established a network. These are architects to begin with, because we were interested in habitational structures. We were interested in the principles that might govern the building of dwellings, basically, and their town planning, so to speak, in a lunar sense, in the first place. And this goes, of course, to one of James's interests too, in property. And I'm very sorry that Yuan can't join us, because she has a very important and interesting perspective, not least that of cooperating between China and Australia. And I fail to get much sense of any of us in earlier sessions that we're interested in talking about what's happening in China. We talk about China as an adversary and as a rival, commercially and strategically, but we don't actually talk about China as a partner in any sense, or as a colleague, I should say. Partner may be stretching the point, but certainly a colleague, asking similar questions. And I dare say they're well ahead of us in a lot of these particular respects. We have a lot to learn from our Chinese friends, which can contribute, of course, to world knowledge and perhaps avoid some of the intricacies of geopolitics as we now see them. Well, look, we've come very much to the...
Tristan's got his hand up there.
I'm sorry, I see you, Tristan. Please.
Look, very briefly, there's a lot to say about what everyone's been saying, but I think it's beholden on me to really sort of caution us as social scientists and caution us as Australians talking about space to not buy in and perpetuate certain myths around what we do. Jumping off what was just said around China, well, there's a reason we don't interoperate much with China, despite them doing great things in space, is because for whatever you think of the politics behind this, we see a lot of problems in what China is doing, the way it interacts with other people, the way it interacts with its own people. For me, a lot of this comes down to we live in a society, not an economy. We live in a society, not a science lab. We're in space because of our values. And I think it's really important that we as social scientists don't perpetuate the myths around space and simplify why we're in space. We're there for alliance reasons. Catherine, I'm happy to talk to you for the rest of the time about why we're engaged with NASA. But essentially, to put it very briefly, it's because of our alliance, it's because of our security that we're involved with NASA. That's why we're involved in space. If we talk about space like we're there because of some sort of higher ideal, I think that has a number of really important ramifications and probably causes a lot of problems because it creates a disconnect between what we're doing and why we think we're doing it. And I think that's what we really have to add as social scientists. And I think we should be really careful that we're not essentially operationalizing what we're doing, whether historians or lawyers or anything else, in service of very niche areas or very sort of limited focus when we should be thinking about what Australia is doing as a whole. And I think that's a value question ultimately, and social scientists are very well placed to discuss that and unpick that.
Well, I thank you very, very much indeed, Christian. And you are not only cautionary, but you're inspiring in that respect, because we do have to think about the relationships between science and security, and values our values combine the two. And I think going forward, the role of the social sciences in helping to develop the agenda in which this conversation takes place I think it is, to my mind, the first thing we can do. It's the first step. And I'm hoping that we can persuade the space agency or whoever else is interested in taking up this subject, whether it be also CSIRO, which hasn't yet brought the social sciences very much into its frame in this respect. But in any case, I think we've come very much to the end of our time, haven't we? Thank you all most warmly, very much grateful to you. Can I pass the baton to Chris to wind us up?
Thank you, Roy, and thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks, everyone, for joining on the webinar. This will be available as a video recording in a week or so, so please do check back to the Academy website where you registered for the event, and you'll be able to see, recap some of the points made and share it with other colleagues as well. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe and well, and hope some of you might be able to join us for our final session tomorrow. Bye-bye.